If you've been paying attention to weight loss recently, you've likely heard of a miracle weight loss drug called semaglutide. This drug was originally developed to treat diabetes, but during clinical trials, it was found to have a significant weight loss effect. As a result, in 2020, pharmaceutical companies started developing a weight loss version aimed at non-diabetic patients, and it quickly received FDA approval, sweeping across the US and European markets. A single injection of semaglutide costs thousands of dollars, which is unaffordable for most consumers. As a result, some people have turned to India, known as a global leader in generic drugs. Indian companies account for half of the top 10 generic drug manufacturers worldwide. However, when it comes to semaglutide, India has fallen behind. While China has made significant progress in producing generics, companies like Qilu Pharmaceutical, Juyu Gene, and Levzon Group have already applied for approval for their domestic versions of semaglutide. So why has India, the generic drug powerhouse, struggled this time? To answer this question, we first need to understand why India's generic drug industry is so strong. A complete industrial chain is usually driven by a huge downstream market, and India's generic drug industry took off thanks to high global profits. After gaining independence, India had almost no pharmaceutical industry, with medicines largely dependent on imports. The few domestic drugs were produced by multinational companies. To change this, in the 1960s and 70s, the Indian government implemented a series of protectionist policies that pushed out foreign companies and allowed domestic pharmaceutical companies to grow rapidly. However, the domestic market was small and highly competitive, so Indian pharmaceutical companies began to expand abroad. In the 1980s, India adopted a humanitarian approach, ignoring patents and selling generics globally. When HIV drugs were monopolized by a few American giants, Indian pharmaceutical companies provided humanitarian aid to Africa with generic versions, slashing the price of AIDS medication from $12,000 per person per year to less than $1 per day. After earning money in low and mid-end markets with cheap generics by ignoring patents, Indian companies turned around and acquired research-capable pharmaceutical companies in the US and Europe, buying patented technology and making it easier to apply for drug approvals locally, further expanding their global market share and achieving industrial internationalization. The vast downstream global pharmaceutical market drove the development of India's upstream and midstream industries. With cheap labor and negligible R&D costs, India dominated the production of raw materials and pharmaceuticals, becoming a global leader in generic drugs. However, all industries face the challenge of upgrading, and India's reliance on the chemical generics model, which brings quick profits without significant R&D investment, proved unsustainable in the field of biological generics. Semaglutide is a typical example. Chemical drugs and biological drugs are vastly different. The main cost of chemical drugs lies in identifying effective clinical compounds from millions of options. In contrast, biological drugs cannot be easily synthesized and rely on other living organisms for production. Since living organisms don't naturally work for drug companies, their cells or microorganisms must first be modified to work, and only after a series of processes like cultivation, fermentation, and purification can the desired drug be produced. The difference between chemical and biological drugs makes the production of generics vastly more difficult. Once a chemical generic manufacturer obtains a molecular formula, it can easily mass-produce the drug, but the efficiency of a biological generic manufacturer depends on how well cells or microorganisms work. Every step, from modifying cells to scaling up production, affects overall efficiency. If the modification fails, the process must start from scratch. The biggest challenge in biological generics lies in production techniques and industrial standards. India's chemical generics industry thrived on cheap labor and benefited from its labor-intensive nature, but the same approach is fatal for biological generics. A drug that only works in the lab is useless without modern production techniques and industrial standards. The backwardness of India's production processes and industrial standards reflects not only a complacency driven by capital but also a shortage of high-skilled labor in the pharmaceutical industry. India does have high-end pharmaceutical talent, but most of them choose to work in the US. By contrast, China's education reforms up to the Soviet era produced a large pool of basic scientific talent. China's advanced investment in education may have created an oversupply of graduates, making employment difficult in some fields. But this large-scale educational investment has provided China with a significant number of highly educated, affordable professionals. This is why it's not surprising that the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State recently called for more Indian students to be admitted to STEM fields to replace Chinese students while encouraging Chinese students to pursue humanities majors. On September 18, India's Modi cabinet approved a new biotechnology research innovation program, pledging over 90 billion rupees to boost India's biopharmaceutical industry and make the country a global leader in biomanufacturing. However, 90 billion rupees is barely enough to build a proper biopharmaceutical factory. Still, it shows that India is aware of its shortcomings. An industry reliant solely on generics will not be competitive in the 21st century.